Alessandro Medici stood at the window of his Florentine palazzo, watching the morning mist rise from the Arno River. The year was 1503, and the city buzzed with the energy of commerce and political intrigue that had made it the jewel of Renaissance Italy. Alessandro had built his trading empire on a simple philosophy: accessibility and generosity would win him allies, customers, and, ultimately, power. For 15 years, this approach had served him well. Too well, perhaps. His steward, Giovanni, knocked softly before entering the chamber. "Master Alessandro, there are 17 merchants waiting in the courtyard. They seek audiences on various matters: credit extensions, partnership proposals, arbitration of disputes. Shall I schedule them throughout the week?" Alessandro turned from the window, his face bearing the weariness that had accumulated over recent months. "No, Giovanni. See them all today. You know I make myself available to anyone who needs counsel or assistance." Giovanni's expression flickered with concern. "Master, if I may, you have been receiving nearly 50 visitors daily. Your own business affairs suffer. The Venice trade route requires your attention, and the silk merchants from Byzantium await your response to their proposal." "The people come first," Alessandro replied, though his voice carried less conviction than in years past. "A merchant who isolates himself from his community becomes irrelevant. Accessibility is power." As Giovanni departed to manage the crowds, Alessandro reflected on how this principle had shaped his rise. 20 years earlier, as a young man with modest inheritance, he had observed his competitors, established merchants who conducted business from behind closed doors, who granted audiences only to the wealthy and influential. Alessandro had chosen a different path. He opened his doors to anyone seeking advice, arbitration, or assistance. Small traders, artisans, even common laborers could approach him directly. The strategy had worked brilliantly. Word of his accessibility spread throughout Florence and beyond. Small merchants flocked to him for guidance, bringing their business along. His reputation as a man of the people attracted customers who preferred dealing with someone they could actually meet and speak with. Political figures began seeking his counsel, knowing he had his finger on the pulse of the common citizen's concerns. Within a decade, Alessandro's trading network had expanded across the Mediterranean. But success had brought unexpected consequences. The trickle of visitors had become a flood. Where once he might see 5 or 6 people seeking guidance each week, he now faced dozens daily. Each person felt entitled to his time and attention, having heard stories of his accessibility. Saying no to anyone seemed to contradict the very reputation that had built his empire. The morning proceeded as expected. Alessandro listened patiently as a wool merchant explained his dispute with a supplier. He offered counsel to a young trader seeking advice on establishing credit with foreign partners. He mediated between 2 artisans quarreling over workshop territories. Each conversation lasted 20 to 30 minutes. Each person left satisfied, spreading further tales of Alessandro's wisdom and generosity. By midday, Alessandro's head throbbed. He had not reviewed a single document related to his own enterprises. The Byzantine proposal remained unopened on his desk. Reports from his agents in Bruges and London awaited his attention. Yet the stream of visitors continued. Marco Salvetti, a minor silk merchant, entered the chamber with an elaborately respectful bow. "Master Alessandro, your reputation for wisdom precedes you throughout the region. I come seeking your guidance on a matter of utmost importance." Alessandro gestured to the chair across from his desk, suppressing his fatigue. "Please, Marco. How may I assist you?" What followed was a 30-minute discourse on a trivial dispute over the quality of silk threads. Marco's competitor had allegedly sold him inferior goods, and he sought Alessandro's intervention. The matter could have been resolved by any competent arbitrator in the merchants' quarter, but Marco had specifically sought out the great Alessandro Medici, whose door was always open. As Marco finally departed with profuse thanks, Alessandro noticed another figure in his doorway. Lucia Tornabuoni, one of Florence's most influential political wives, entered with the measured grace of nobility. "Alessandro," she began without preamble, "I trust you have time for a matter of genuine importance?" Of course, Donna Lucia. Please, sit. Lucia's expression carried subtle reproach. I sent a message 3 days ago requesting an audience. Your steward informed me you were occupied with various citizens. I waited, assuming you would make time for discussions that might affect your standing with the Signoria. When I heard you were available to anyone who simply appeared at your door, I decided to adopt that approach myself. Alessandro felt a flush of embarrassment. Lucia Tornabuoni's husband held significant influence in Florence's governing council. Her matter of genuine importance likely concerned political developments that could impact trade regulations or tax policies, issues that directly affected his business empire. Yet he had inadvertently made her wait while attending to Marco's silk thread dispute. Forgive me, Donna Lucia. My intention was never to. Your intention is clear, she interrupted with cool politeness. You have chosen to make yourself equally available to all citizens, regardless of their importance or the significance of their concerns. While admirable in its democratic spirit, this approach has practical consequences. When everything becomes a priority, nothing is a priority. Her words struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. What did you wish to discuss? New tariff regulations being proposed by the Signoria. They could significantly impact Mediterranean trade routes. I had hoped to give you advance warning and seek your input before the measures are finalized. However, I see that your schedule does not permit lengthy discussions of complex matters. Alessandro glanced toward his doorway, where several more visitors waited. The irony was crushing. By making himself accessible to everyone, he had made himself inaccessible to those who mattered most. The very reputation that had built his power was now undermining it. I can make time, he said desperately. Perhaps this evening I dine with the Signoria members who will vote on these measures, Lucia replied, rising gracefully. The opportunity for input has passed. I merely thought you should be aware of what is coming. After her departure, Alessandro sat in silence for several minutes. The lesson was crystallizing with painful clarity. His accessibility had become a liability. By refusing to establish boundaries or hierarchies in his availability, he had inadvertently signaled that all matters were of equal importance, and that he was of equal importance to everyone who sought him out. The afternoon brought more visitors. A young apprentice sought advice on romantic troubles. An aging craftsman wanted Alessandro to mediate a dispute with his landlord. A merchant's wife requested his opinion on a proposed dowry arrangement. Each person consumed 20 or 30 minutes of his time with matters that, while personally significant to them, bore no relation to Alessandro's expertise or interests. As evening approached, Giovanni returned to his study. Master, there are still 8 visitors waiting. Shall I schedule them for tomorrow? Alessandro looked at the stack of unread documents, the unanswered correspondence, the business proposals that required his attention. For the first time in 15 years, he made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable that morning. No. Tell them my schedule is full for the remainder of the week. They may request appointments through you, and we will accommodate them as time permits. Giovanni's eyebrows rose slightly. All of them, master? All of them. That night, Alessandro dined alone and contemplated the transformation that had occurred without his awareness. His accessibility had evolved from a strategic advantage into a strategic weakness. By making himself available to everyone, he had lost the ability to prioritize anything. The democratic ideal of equal access had collided with the practical reality that not all matters, and not all people carried equal weight in the complex web of commerce and politics. He thought of Niccolò Machiavelli, whose treatises on power and governance were being discussed in learned circles throughout Italy. Machiavelli had written extensively about the delicate balance rulers must strike between accessibility and authority. A prince who made himself too available to his subjects risked losing their respect and his own effectiveness. Yet a ruler who isolated himself completely lost touch with his realm's realities. The challenge lay in finding the middle path, accessible enough to remain connected and informed, but selective enough to preserve time, energy, and dignity. Alessandro realized he had swung too far toward accessibility, sacrificing his strategic effectiveness for the illusion of democratic virtue. The next morning brought a test of his new resolve. Alessandro instructed Giovanni to implement a structured system. Visitors would be categorized, urgent business matters received immediate attention, routine consultations were scheduled for specific days, and purely social requests were politely redirected unless they came from individuals of particular importance to his network. The first challenge came before noon. Marco Salvetti returned, this time with 2 other silk merchants, seeking Alessandro's arbitration in an expanded version of the previous day's dispute. Giovanni informed them that Master Alessandro's schedule was fully committed, but they could request an appointment for the following week. Marco's reaction was immediate and telling. But Master Alessandro sees anyone who needs help. He told me so himself just yesterday. Master Alessandro continues to assist those in need, Giovanni replied diplomatically. However, he has found it necessary to organize his schedule more efficiently to serve everyone better. The silk merchants departed with obvious displeasure, muttering about Alessandro's newfound arrogance and changing character. Word spread quickly through Florence's merchant quarter that the famously accessible Alessandro Medici had suddenly become selective about his time. Some reactions were predictable. Smaller traders who had grown accustomed to immediate access grumbled about his transformation. A few spread rumors that success had corrupted him, that he now considered himself too important for common merchants. These criticisms stung, as they contained a grain of truth. He was, in fact, acknowledging his own importance in a way he had previously avoided. But other reactions surprised him. Lucia Tornabuoni sent a note expressing appreciation for his new efficiency and requesting a meeting to discuss the tariff regulations. Several major trading partners commented favorably on his improved organization. Most tellingly, his business affairs began operating more smoothly. Documents received timely attention. Important proposals were reviewed thoroughly rather than hurriedly. Strategic decisions received the contemplation they deserved. Within a month, Alessandro observed a curious phenomenon. By becoming less accessible, he had somehow become more valued. People who previously took his availability for granted now appreciated the time they received. Meetings became more focused and productive when participants knew time was limited and precious. The quality of his counsel improved when he was not exhausted from entertaining dozens of trivial concerns daily. Yet the transformation came with genuine costs. Some relationships suffered. A few loyal supporters felt abandoned. The criticism about his changing character was not entirely unfair. He had changed, become more calculating about how he invested his time and energy. The question was whether this change represented growth or corruption. One evening, as Alessandro worked late in his study, Giovanni brought news that crystallized his evolving understanding. "Master, I thought you should know. Lorenzo de' Medici's son approached me today seeking an audience with you." When I explained our new scheduling system, he seemed pleased. Pleased? He commented that it was refreshing to encounter a successful merchant who valued his own time appropriately. He said it suggested you might be worthy of more significant discussions in the future. Alessandro smiled grimly. Lorenzo de' Medici's family represented the pinnacle of Florentine power and influence. Their approval could open doors throughout Italy and beyond. Yet this approval had come not from his previous accessibility, but from his newly established boundaries. The irony was complete. By making himself less accessible to everyone, he had made himself more accessible to those who truly mattered. The democratic ideal of equal availability had proven not just impractical but counterproductive. True influence required the wisdom to distinguish between the important and the urgent, between those who deserved immediate attention and those who could wait. As winter settled over Florence, Alessandro reflected on the deeper lesson embedded in his experience. Accessibility, like any virtue, became a vice when taken to extremes. The price of being too accessible was not just personal exhaustion, though that was considerable, but the undermining of one's own effectiveness and, ultimately, one's ability to help anyone at all. He thought again of Machiavelli's writings about the loneliness of leadership and the necessity of making difficult choices. A leader who tried to please everyone pleased no one. A merchant who made himself available to everyone made himself useful to no one. The harsh mathematics of time and energy demanded prioritization, and prioritization required the courage to say no. The man who destroyed his weak self, the part that sought universal approval and avoided difficult choices, could indeed become invulnerable to destruction by others. But this transformation required abandoning comfortable illusions about democratic virtue and embracing the uncomfortable reality that not all people, and not all requests, deserved equal consideration. Alessandro had learned that true strength lay not in accessibility, but in the wisdom to know when to be accessible and to whom. This knowledge would serve as the foundation for the next phase of his evolution, a phase that would test whether he could apply these lessons consistently and effectively in the face of greater challenges. Part 2, The Fortress of Solitude. 6 months after implementing his new scheduling system, Alessandro faced a crisis that would test every lesson he had learned about accessibility and boundaries. The crisis began, as many do, with an appearance of opportunity. Ferdinando Gonzaga, a prominent banker from Mantua, arrived in Florence with a proposal that seemed to promise extraordinary profits. He sought to establish a new trade route through the Ottoman territories, bypassing the traditional Venetian monopolies. The potential returns were enormous, but the venture required significant capital and, more importantly, the backing of Florence's most respected merchants. Ferdinando had approached several established trading houses, but each had declined involvement. Too risky, they said. Too dependent on political relationships that could shift overnight. Too many variables beyond anyone's control. When Ferdinando requested a meeting with Alessandro, Giovanni initially scheduled it according to their new system, 2 weeks hence, with a 1-hour time limit. But Ferdinando pressed for urgency, claiming that Ottoman negotiations required immediate responses. Against his better judgment, Alessandro agreed to see him that afternoon. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Ferdinando was persuasive, knowledgeable, and seemingly well-connected. He spoke of relationships with Ottoman officials, of trade goods in high demand throughout Europe, of profits that could triple Alessandro's wealth within 5 years. More seductively, he spoke of the vision, bypassing the stranglehold that Venice held over Eastern trade, opening new routes that would benefit all of Italy. By the meeting's end, Alessandro found himself provisionally committed to investing a substantial portion of his liquid capital. Ferdinando needed an answer within a week, he claimed, as other investors were considering the opportunity. That evening, Alessandro felt the familiar excitement of a new venture. But something nagged at him, a sense that he had been manipulated, that the urgency and accessibility Ferdinando had demanded had prevented careful consideration. He decided to investigate quietly. Using his network of contacts, Alessandro began inquiring about Ferdinando's background and previous ventures. What he discovered was troubling. Ferdinando was indeed a banker from Mantua, but his recent projects had ended in failure. The Ottoman connections he claimed were questionable at best. Most damaging, the other investors he mentioned as competitors were fictional, a tactic to create false urgency. Alessandro had been deceived, but the deception succeeded only because he had made himself accessible under pressure. The old Alessandro, the one who saw everyone immediately, would have fallen completely for Ferdinando's scheme. But his recent experiences had taught him to recognize manipulation tactics, particularly those that exploited his accessibility. The question now was how to extract himself from the provisional commitment without losing face or creating legal complications. More importantly, how could he prevent similar situations in the future? The answer came from an unexpected source. During a dinner with Lucia Tornabuoni and her husband, Alessandro mentioned his predicament in general terms. Roberto Tornabuoni listened thoughtfully before offering advice that would reshape Alessandro's understanding of power dynamics. Alessandro, Roberto said, your problem is not that you were deceived. Any of us might have been deceived by a skilled manipulator. Your problem is that you allowed urgency imposed by others to override your own judgment. A man of true power sets the terms of engagement. He does not allow others to dictate when decisions must be made or how much time he will invest in their proposals. But, if I had insisted on my normal scheduling, Ferdinando might have taken his proposal elsewhere. Precisely, Roberto smiled. And, if his proposal had genuine merit, he would have waited for your schedule. The fact that he demanded immediate accessibility was itself a warning sign. Legitimate opportunities do not require abandoning sound business practices. Lucia nodded agreement. My husband has learned this through years in the Signoria. Those who respect your time and procedures are generally worthy of it. Those who demand exceptions often have reasons for avoiding careful scrutiny. The conversation continued late into the evening, touching on themes that went far beyond Alessandro's immediate problem. They discussed the psychology of influence, the tactics used by those who sought to exploit others' accessibility, and the defensive measures that successful people develop to protect their time and judgment. Roberto shared examples from his political career. Petitioners often claim their matters are urgent when urgency serves their interests, not necessarily the truth. I learned to distinguish between genuine emergencies and manufactured crises. The former are rare, the latter are constant. How do you make that distinction? Alessandro asked. Time reveals truth, Roberto replied. Genuine emergencies remain emergencies whether you address them immediately or after proper consideration. False emergencies dissolve under scrutiny. Ferdinando's proposal will prove its worth or worthlessness whether you decide today or next month. Alessandro took this advice literally. Rather than responding to Ferdinando within the demanded week, he sent word that he required additional time for due diligence. Ferdinando's reaction was revealing, first anger, then desperate attempts to re-establish urgency, finally, withdrawal of the offer entirely when Alessandro refused to be rushed. The experience taught Alessandro a crucial lesson about the relationship between accessibility and vulnerability. Those who sought to exploit others often began by testing boundaries around time and attention. They manufactured urgency to prevent careful consideration. They demanded accessibility as a form of control. Defending against such tactics required more than just scheduling systems. It required the psychological strength to disappoint people who claimed their needs were urgent. It required the confidence to let opportunities disappear rather than make hasty decisions. Most difficultly, it required accepting that some people would consider him arrogant or unreasonable for insisting on proper procedures. This last point proved prophetic. Word of Alessandro's rejection of Ferdinando's proposal spread through Florence's merchant community. Some praised his caution, but others criticized what they saw as excessive pride. The democratic narrative that had once served him, the story of the accessible, egalitarian merchant, was giving way to a more complex reputation. Some former supporters began describing Alessandro as changed, as having lost touch with his humble origins. A few clients took their business elsewhere, seeking merchants who were more accommodating and flexible. The criticism stung because it contained elements of truth. He had become more selective, more demanding of others' respect for his time and procedures. But the benefits of this evolution were becoming undeniable. The quality of opportunities that came to him improved dramatically. Serious partners appreciated his thoroughness and respected his boundaries. His business decisions, made with proper consideration rather than under artificial pressure, proved more successful. More subtly, Alessandro noticed changes in how others treated him. People who had previously assumed they could demand immediate attention began approaching him with greater preparation and respect. Meetings became more productive when participants knew they had to justify their requests for his time. The transformation was exemplified by his relationship with the Venetian Trading Consortium. For years, they had treated Alessandro as a useful but subordinate partner, someone who could be summoned for meetings on short notice and expected to accommodate their schedules. The consortium's senior partners had grown accustomed to his accessibility and flexibility. When they requested a meeting to discuss new partnership terms, Alessandro's steward informed them that his schedule could accommodate them in 3 weeks. The consortium's response was immediate indignation. How dare a Florentine merchant make Venetian nobility wait? Alessandro faced a choice between accommodation and principle. The old Alessandro would have rearranged his schedule immediately, apologizing for any inconvenience and grateful for their continued partnership. The new Alessandro recognized this as a test of his newly established boundaries. He sent a polite response suggesting that if 3 weeks was too long to wait, they were welcome to conduct their business with other partners. The message was courteous but firm. His schedule would not be rearranged to accommodate their preferences. The consortium's initial reaction was anger and threats to end their partnership. But, after a week of consideration, they agreed to the scheduled meeting. When they finally met, the dynamic had shifted fundamentally. Instead of dictating terms, the Venetians presented proposals for Alessandro's consideration. Instead of assuming his compliance, they sought his agreement. The meeting concluded with terms more favorable to Alessandro than any previous arrangement. The consortium's senior partner, Lorenzo Bembo, made a comment that crystallized the transformation. "We had not realized how significant your operations had become, Alessandro. We appreciate your willingness to make time for us in your busy schedule." This small reversal of language, from their making time for him to his making time for them, represented a seismic shift in the relationship. By becoming less accessible, Alessandro had paradoxically increased his perceived value and importance. The lesson extended beyond business relationships. Alessandro began applying the same principles to social and political interactions. Instead of attending every gathering he was invited to, he became selective. Instead of making himself available for every consultation requested, he established criteria for when his counsel was appropriate. The results were initially uncomfortable but, ultimately transformative. Social invitations became more carefully considered when hosts knew Alessandro might decline. Political figures began treating his time as valuable when they could no longer assume his availability. Even family members approached him with greater respect when they understood he would not automatically rearrange his schedule for non-urgent matters. But, the most significant change was internal. Alessandro discovered that defending his boundaries required developing new aspects of his character. He had to become comfortable with disappointing people who made unreasonable demands. He had to accept being seen as less universally likable in order to become more genuinely respected. This transformation was not without costs. Some relationships ended when the other party could not accept the new dynamics. A few long-term friendships cooled when Alessandro refused to maintain the one-sided accessibility they had grown accustomed to. The emotional price of establishing boundaries was higher than he had anticipated. Yet these losses revealed the true nature of many relationships he had thought were based on mutual respect and affection. When his accessibility changed, some people's interest in him disappeared entirely. The painful realization was that they had valued his availability more than his friendship, his willingness to accommodate them more than his character or companionship. Those relationships that survived his transformation proved stronger and more balanced. Friends and partners who respected his boundaries also respected him as a person. Business associates who adapted to his procedures also valued his expertise and judgment. The relationships that remained were fewer in number but greater in quality. By winter's end, Alessandro had achieved something he had not thought possible a year earlier. He had gained the respect of Florence's most influential figures while maintaining meaningful connections with those who truly mattered to him. His business had grown more profitable despite, or perhaps because of, his reduced accessibility. His time was filled with activities and relationships that brought genuine satisfaction rather than obligation. The man who had once prided himself on being available to everyone had learned to take pride in being selective about his availability. This selectivity was not born of arrogance but of wisdom, the recognition that time and energy were finite resources that could either be scattered ineffectively or focused purposefully. Alessandro understood now that Machiavelli's observations about power were not merely political but fundamentally human. The prince who made himself too available to his subjects lost their respect and his own effectiveness. The merchant who made himself too accessible to everyone made himself useful to no one who truly mattered. The destruction of his weak self, the part that craved universal approval and feared disappointing anyone, had indeed made him invulnerable to destruction by others. But this invulnerability came at the price of comfortable illusions about human nature and the dynamics of respect and influence. As spring arrived in Florence, Alessandro prepared for the next phase of his education in the realities of power and human nature. He had learned to control his accessibility and defend his boundaries. The question now was whether he could maintain these lessons when faced with greater challenges and more subtle forms of manipulation. Part 3, The Invulnerable Self. The true test of Alessandro's transformation came not from obvious challenges like Ferdinando's deception, but from subtler pressures that threatened to erode the boundaries he had fought to establish. The test began with success itself. By the spring of 1504, Alessandro's reputation had evolved from that of an accessible merchant to a discerning power broker. His careful selection of partners and opportunities had yielded extraordinary profits. The Ottoman trade routes that Ferdinando had proposed fraudulently, Alessandro had later developed legitimately through patient relationship building and proper due diligence. His silk operations had expanded throughout the Mediterranean. Political connections in Florence, Venice, and Rome sought his counsel on matters of trade and finance. Success, however, brought new forms of vulnerability. As Alessandro's influence grew, so did the sophistication of those who sought to exploit it. The crude tactics of manufactured urgency and false scarcity gave way to more elegant forms of manipulation, appeals to his reputation, challenges to his consistency, and social pressures that threatened to undermine his hard-won boundaries. The first major test came from Cardinal Francesco Soderini, one of Florence's most influential religious and political figures. The cardinal approached Alessandro not with a business proposal, but with a request for charitable support. The city's main orphanage faced closure due to financial difficulties. Would Alessandro consider providing the necessary funds to keep it operating? The request seemed straightforward, but its presentation was masterful manipulation. Cardinal Soderini did not schedule a formal meeting through Giovanni. Instead, he approached Alessandro after Sunday Mass, in full view of Florence's social elite. The conversation was brief and public, making refusal difficult without appearing heartless before witnesses. Alessandro, the cardinal said warmly, your reputation for generosity precedes you throughout Florence. I know you understand the importance of caring for our city's most vulnerable citizens. Alessandro recognized the trap immediately. The cardinal had chosen a cause that was unquestionably worthy, a setting that made refusal socially costly, and phrasing that implied Alessandro's reputation depended on immediate agreement. Refusing would seem cruel and hypocritical given his known wealth. Your Excellence, Alessandro replied carefully, the welfare of Florence's children is indeed important to all citizens. Perhaps we could arrange a time to discuss how I might best contribute to this worthy cause. The cardinal's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, my son. However, time is pressing. The orphanage faces closure within days if funding is not secured. I'm sure you would not want these innocent children to suffer while we arrange convenient meeting times. Here was the familiar tactic of manufactured urgency, dressed in noble purpose. The cardinal was demanding immediate accessibility for what he claimed was an emergency, using social pressure and moral obligation to override Alessandro's established procedures. Alessandro faced a choice that would define whether his transformation was genuine or merely superficial. He could accommodate the cardinal's demand, justifying it as an exception for charitable purpose. Or he could maintain his boundaries even when doing so might appear heartless to observers. Your Excellence, Alessandro said firmly, matters of this importance deserve careful consideration rather than hasty decisions. My steward will contact you tomorrow to arrange a meeting where we can discuss the situation properly. The cardinal's displeasure was evident, but he could hardly argue against careful consideration in front of witnesses. Very well, Alessandro. I pray these children's welfare does not suffer due to procedures. The words were chosen to maximize guilt and social pressure. Several prominent citizens had overheard the conversation and were clearly forming judgments about Alessandro's character. By evening, rumors circulated that Alessandro Medici had refused to save orphan children because the request had not been submitted through proper channels. The criticism was intense and immediate. Some called him heartless, others accused him of losing touch with Christian charity in his pursuit of business efficiency. The democratic narrative about his accessibility was weaponized against him. How could someone who once helped anyone in need now refuse to help children in crisis? Alessandro spent a sleepless night questioning his decision. Had he become so rigid in maintaining boundaries that he had lost his humanity? Was defending procedures worth the cost of appearing cruel and selfish? But, when he met with Cardinal Soderini 2 days later, the truth became clear. The orphanage did face financial difficulties, but the crisis was neither as immediate nor as severe as claimed. Other potential donors had been approached but not given time to consider their responses. Most tellingly, the cardinal's preferred solution involved not just charitable donations but a complex arrangement that would have given him control over how funds were managed and distributed. Alessandro agreed to provide substantial support for the orphanage, but through direct payment to the institution rather than through the cardinal's proposed arrangement. The children's needs were met, but without the manipulation and control that had been the true objective of the cardinal's pressure tactics. The experience taught Alessandro that his previous reputation for accessibility had created expectations that some people would attempt to exploit through moral and social pressure. Those who could no longer manipulate him through business urgency would try appeals to virtue, charity, and social responsibility. More importantly, he learned that maintaining boundaries required not just procedural consistency but psychological courage. The criticism he faced for refusing immediate compliance was genuine and painful. Some of it was deserved. He had become less spontaneously generous and more calculating in his charitable giving. But the alternative was returning to a state where anyone could manipulate him by choosing the right cause or applying the right pressure. The lesson proved relevant sooner than expected. Within weeks, Alessandro faced similar attempts at manipulation from various quarters. A former business partner claimed urgent need for advice on a matter that was actually an attempt to gain insider information about Alessandro's newest ventures. A political figure demanded immediate consultation on what he claimed was a crisis but was actually a routine matter that could wait. In each case, Alessandro faced the choice between accommodation and boundary maintenance. Each time he chose boundaries, he faced criticism about his changing character and lost humanity. The psychological pressure was constant and exhausting. But, gradually, a different pattern emerged. Those who genuinely respected Alessandro adapted to his new procedures and found them reasonable. Legitimate emergencies, which proved rare, received immediate attention, while manufactured crises were politely deferred. People learned that Alessandro remained generous and helpful, but on his own terms rather than theirs. More significantly, Alessandro began attracting a different type of relationship and opportunity. Serious partners appreciated his thoroughness and respected his boundaries. Political figures of genuine importance valued his counsel more highly because it was not readily available to everyone. Even charitable organizations found that his carefully considered contributions were more substantial and effective than his previous spontaneous donations. The transformation was exemplified by his relationship with Lorenzo de' Medici, scion of Florence's most powerful family. Lorenzo had been observing Alessandro's evolution with interest, particularly his handling of the cardinal's manipulation. "Alessandro," Lorenzo said during a private dinner, "I watched your recent discussion with Cardinal Soderini with great interest. You handled a difficult situation with remarkable skill." "I'm not sure everyone would agree with that assessment," Alessandro replied ruefully. "The opinions of everyone are irrelevant," Lorenzo responded firmly. "The opinions of people who matter are what counts. Cardinal Soderini attempted to manipulate you through public pressure and false urgency. You refused to be manipulated while still addressing the legitimate need he claimed to represent. That demonstrates both strength and wisdom." Lorenzo leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Alessandro, I want you to understand something important. A man who can be manipulated through appeals to his reputation, his charity, or his past behavior is a man who cannot be trusted with important matters. If you had yielded to the cardinal's pressure, it would have demonstrated that you could be controlled by anyone clever enough to choose the right leverage." The conversation continued late into the evening, with Lorenzo sharing insights about power dynamics that Alessandro had only begun to understand. The most successful and influential people, Lorenzo explained, were those who had learned to distinguish between genuine needs and manufactured crises, between legitimate requests and disguised manipulation. "The weak self you have destroyed," Lorenzo said, "was the part of you that needed everyone's approval and feared disappointing anyone. That weakness made you useful to others but powerless yourself. The strong self you have developed can disappoint some people in order to serve those who truly matter." This perspective reframed Alessandro's transformation in terms that resonated with Machiavelli's writings about the nature of power and leadership. A leader who tried to please everyone pleased no one who mattered. A merchant who made himself available to all became useful to none who could advance his interests. But Lorenzo's next observation was the most profound. The man who destroys his weak self becomes invulnerable to destruction by others because he no longer provides the handles by which others can grasp and control him. Your accessibility was such a handle. Your need for universal approval was such a handle. Your fear of being seen as heartless or arrogant was such a handle. Alessandro understood that his transformation was not complete, it was ongoing. Each situation that tested his boundaries was an opportunity to strengthen them or allow them to erode. Each person who attempted manipulation was training him to recognize and resist increasingly sophisticated tactics. The process was difficult because it required constant vigilance and frequent disappointment of others' expectations. The old Alessandro had been easier to like because he accommodated everyone's preferences. The new Alessandro was harder to like but easier to respect because he maintained consistent standards. Over the following months, Alessandro developed what he came to think of as his invulnerable self, a version of his character that could not be manipulated through the tactics that had previously controlled him. This self was not cruel or heartless, but it was selective and purposeful in its accessibility and generosity. The invulnerable self made decisions based on careful consideration rather than emotional pressure. It distinguished between legitimate needs and manufactured crises. It valued quality relationships over quantity. Most importantly, it accepted being disliked by some people as the price of being genuinely respected by those who mattered. By year's end, Alessandro had achieved something remarkable. He had maintained his fundamental character, his intelligence, generosity, and desire to help others, while eliminating the weaknesses that had made him vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. He remained accessible, but selectively so. He remained generous, but thoughtfully so. The transformation had cost him some relationships and considerable comfort. The universal approval he had once enjoyed was replaced by more complex reactions, genuine respect from some, resentment from others, and indifference from those who had only valued his availability. But the gains were profound. His time was his own to allocate purposefully. His energy went toward relationships and activities that brought genuine satisfaction. His business decisions, made without pressure and manipulation, proved consistently sound. His charitable giving, though more selective, was more substantial and effective. Most importantly, Alessandro had learned that true strength lay not in being liked by everyone, but in being respected by those who mattered. The weak self that craved universal approval had indeed been destroyed, and in its place had emerged a character that could not be destroyed by others because it provided no leverage for them to grasp. The price of this transformation had been high comfort, universal approval, and the easy relationships that came with constant accessibility. But the reward was higher still: genuine respect, meaningful relationships, and the ability to pursue his own goals without constant interference from those who sought to exploit his weaknesses. As Alessandro stood again at his window overlooking the Arno, exactly 2 years after beginning his transformation, he reflected on the journey from accessibility to selectivity, from universal availability to purposeful boundaries. The man who had once prided himself on seeing anyone who needed help had learned to help people more effectively by choosing carefully whom to see and when. The weak self that had made him vulnerable to every form of manipulation and exploitation was gone, destroyed by the accumulated wisdom of difficult experiences and painful lessons. In its place stood a character that could not be destroyed by others because it no longer provided the handles, accessibility, need for approval, fear of criticism, by which others had once controlled him. The price paid for being too accessible had been the loss of genuine power and effectiveness. The price paid for destroying the weak self had been comfort and universal approval. But Alessandro had learned that some prices were worth paying, and some transformations, however difficult, were necessary for anyone who sought to achieve anything meaningful in a world where manipulation and exploitation were constant threats. The invulnerable self was not invulnerable to all harm, no one could be that. But it was invulnerable to the specific forms of destruction that came from allowing others to control one's time, energy, and decisions through manufactured pressure and false emergencies. In learning to say no to some people, Alessandro had gained the ability to say yes to what truly mattered. The document of his transformation was complete, written not in words but in the accumulated decisions that had shaped his character. From accessibility to selectivity, from universal approval to earned respect, from vulnerability to invulnerability, the journey had been neither easy nor comfortable, but it had been necessary. The man who destroys his weak self can indeed never be destroyed by others, but only by learning to recognize which parts of himself serve his purposes and which serve the purposes of those who would exploit him. In Alessandro's case, the transformation had revealed that true strength lay not in accommodating everyone's demands, but in having the wisdom and courage to disappoint those whose demands were unreasonable, manipulative, or destructive. The price of being too accessible had been paid in full, and the lessons learned would serve him for the remainder of his days. The weak self was destroyed, and the invulnerable self had taken its place, not invulnerable to all harm, but invulnerable to the specific forms of destruction that came from allowing others to exploit one's good intentions and generous spirit. In the end, Alessandro had learned Machiavelli's greatest lesson, that virtue without boundaries becomes vice, that strength without selectivity becomes weakness, and that the man who would help everyone effectively must first learn to help himself by choosing carefully whom to help and how to help them. The transformation was complete, the price was paid, and the invulnerable self stood ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, not as a victim of others' manipulation, but as a master of his own destiny.